The Atlantic had taken 14 days. Hannah Free had counted them the way she counted everything. Carefully, without sentimentality, in the manner of a woman who had spent 4 years as a bookkeeper for a textile importing firm in Cologne and had learned that numbers were the most honest language available to her. 14 days on a converted transport vessel with 300 other German women auxiliaries and a sea that had no opinion about any of them. 14 days of gray water and gray sky, and the particular quality of waiting that comes when the thing you are waiting for is not an event, but an arrival at an unknown condition. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair she kept pinned back with 2 clips that she had carried in her coat pocket since processing, because the bag containing her personal effects had been catalogued and stored somewhere she could not access, and the clips were what she had thought to keep. She was not tall. She had the build of someone who had grown up in a city during years of gradual rationing. Not thin in a way that announced itself, but lean in the specific way of a body that had learned to run efficiently on what was provided. She was not, she would have told you, a political person. She had not joined anything beyond what was required. She had attended the rallies that her employer expected her to attend, and had stood in the crowds and raised her arm at the prescribed moments and returned to her desk on Monday mornings and continued entering numbers in columns. She had believed what she was told the way a person believes the weather forecast, not with fervor, but with the practical acceptance of information delivered by sources that were supposed to know. What she had been told, in the accumulated form of 12 years of newspapers and radio broadcasts and rallies, and the particular architecture of what was said and what was not said, was this. America was vast and loud and internally divided, a country of racial chaos and soft people who had never known real war, a society that mistook comfort for strength and would dissolve when genuinely tested. Its soldiers were reluctant. Its civilians were spoiled. Its cities were full of crime, and its government was controlled by interests that did not represent its people. She had not examined these beliefs closely. There had been no reason to. They sat in her the way furniture sits in a room you have lived in for a long time. Present, functional, unremarked upon. The ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia on a morning in June 1943 that was already warm at 7 o'clock in a way that told her this was a different kind of heat than anything Germany had offered her. Humid and dense, the air pressing against her skin as she came down the gangplank with her 2 hair clips in her coat pocket and her eyes moving across the dock with the automatic inventory taking of someone whose profession had trained her to assess a room before she finished entering it. The dock was enormous. She had known this in the way she knew things from reports and allocations. American port capacity, American tonnage figures, numbers she had seen in documents that passed through the import firm's offices before the war. But the numbers had been numbers, and this was a dock, and the difference between those two things was the difference between reading the word ocean and standing at its edge. Cranes moved in every direction, their cables catching the morning light. Ships stood at multiple berths simultaneously, each one being loaded or unloaded by crews that moved with the organized efficiency of systems that had been running long enough to stop thinking about themselves. The machinery was new, or close to it. She could tell by the way it moved, without the compensatory adjustments of equipment that had been asked to do too much for too long. Everything here sounded like it had been built recently and maintained carefully, which was a sound she had almost forgotten. And the workers, black and white men operating side by side on the same crane controls, the same loading equipment, the same dock without apparent organization by anything other than the task at hand. In Germany, such an arrangement had been rendered not merely unusual, but illegal. Here it was simply how a dock operated in the morning, as unremarkable as the water beneath it. She stood on the gangplank for a moment longer than she should have, and the woman behind her touched her elbow gently, and she moved on. The train journey took 3 days. They traveled in actual passenger coaches, cushioned seats, windows that opened, a dining car that served food at scheduled intervals that arrived on schedule. Hannah sat at a window seat for most of the journey because the window was where the information was, and information was what she needed. The train did not hide. This was the fact that accumulated with the first few hours and did not stop accumulating for 3 days. It moved through American cities and American industrial landscapes without curtains on the windows, without reduced speed near sensitive installations, without the elaborate detours and concealment protocols she had understood to be standard practice for military movements in any country at war. Factories displayed their names in letters large enough to read from a moving train. Parking lots beside defense plants were full of workers' personal automobiles, visible from the track, countable, not concealed. A plant outside Baltimore had aircraft lined up on a delivery apron. B-26 bombers, she was told later, though she could not have identified them at the time, sitting in plain sight of an enemy transport as though the enemy's knowledge of their existence was not a thing worth managing. She thought about this for a long time. In Cologne, by 1942, the factories she dealt with for the import firm had removed their signage, covered their windows, rerouted their supplier access to avoid pattern recognition from above. Every business that produced anything of value had learned to make itself difficult to read from the outside. Visibility was vulnerability. This had seemed, at the time, like simple logic. Here was a country that had apparently reached a different conclusion. At a station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the train stopped for 40 minutes. Through the window, Hannah watched American families on the platform, wives seeing off husbands in uniform, children waving small flags, a group of teenagers sharing something from a paper bag near the station restaurant. The platform was ordinary in every direction. Nobody was performing patriotism. Nobody was being watched to confirm they were performing it correctly. A woman put her hand briefly on a soldier's cheek, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood like that for a moment, and then the boarding call came. At another stop, a worker on the platform opened his lunchbox, ate half a sandwich, looked at his watch, closed the box, and walked away without finishing it. Hannah watched this from the train window, and then looked at the floor of the car for a moment before looking back at the platform. But the man was already gone. She did not write this down. She did not have anything to write in. But she filed it in the specific drawer in her mind where she kept things that did not yet have a column to belong to. Camp Hearn sat in Robertson County, Texas, on 720 acres that the Army Corps of Engineers had organized with the thoroughness of an institution that did not do things partially. Wooden barracks with electric lights. Indoor plumbing. Individual beds with mattresses and sheets and blankets that had been laundered before her arrival, which she knew because they smelled of soap rather than use. A recreation hall with a ping-pong table and an upright piano and a shelf of books. A medical clinic. A canteen where prisoners could purchase goods with script earned from voluntary labor. The canteen stopped her entirely on the first tour. Not the building. The concept. Enemy prisoners, purchasing goods, choosing purchases, walking out with items they had selected because they wanted them rather than because they had been issued. The idea that want was a category that applied to her here, that she was a person with preferences that the system around her was prepared to accommodate, was so foreign to her recent experience that she stood in front of the canteen's small display of cigarettes and chocolate and writing materials for longer than was natural, long enough that the woman behind her said something in German under her breath and moved around her. Hannah bought a small notebook. She did not ask herself why. She paid for it with the script she had been given at processing and walked out with it in her hand and stood in the Texas sun for a moment before putting it in her coat pocket beside the 2 hair clips. That evening she opened it to the first page and wrote the date and the location and then nothing else, because she did not yet know what to write, only that there would be things worth writing. The work assignment came on the 3rd morning. A female corporal named Harris moved through the barracks distributing forms with the efficient unhurriedness that Hannah had already begun to associate with American administrative procedure, things done correctly and without theater, because correctness was its own justification and theater wasted time. The form listed available assignments. Kitchen duty, laundry, agricultural work, clerical assistance, and near the bottom, counter assistant, Dottie's lunch, Main Street, Hearn, Monday through Saturday. Transport provided. Some English helpful. Hannah read the description twice. A lunch counter. In the town. Among civilians. She signed her name next to it with the particular decisiveness of someone who does not know exactly why they are deciding, but understands that the decision is right. Sergeant Earl Denton drove the transport truck with the unhurried competence of a man who had made this drive enough times that it had become part of his body's knowledge rather than his mind's. He was 41, from a town in Georgia called Valdosta, with the broad hands of someone who had worked outdoors before the army and would work outdoors after it. He spoke his German the way a person speaks a language learned from a book and then practiced on real people until the book receded, imperfect in grammar, reliable in meaning. He said good morning to each woman as she climbed into the truck bed with the same, even courtesy he would have used for anyone, which Hannah noticed and filed in the notebook column she was keeping in her head. The truck left camp through the main gate and turned onto the county road heading south toward Hearn. The Texas landscape opened on both sides, flat and wide, and entirely uninterested in the reactions of people passing through it, land that had been doing what it did long before the war and intended to continue long after. The sky above it was enormous, the kind of sky that had no equivalent in a city, pale at the edges and deepening toward the center, going on past the point where looking had any purpose. Hannah sat on the left bench of the truck bed and watched it pass. Then the outskirts of Hearn appeared, and with them the Cotton Gin on the right side of the road, and with the Cotton Gin its parking lot. She saw it before she understood what she was seeing. A flat expanse of packed earth beside the Jin's main building, and in it, arranged in rough rows with the casual organization of people who have parked in the same place many times, vehicles. Personal vehicles. Trucks and automobiles belonging to the workers who had arrived that morning and would leave that evening and return the next morning and park in roughly the same spots. She counted. She got to 31 before the truck had passed the lot entirely, and she was looking at the back of the Jin building instead. 31 personal vehicles belonging to ordinary factory workers, parked beside their place of work on a Tuesday morning in June, as unremarkable as the sky above them. She turned to look back through the gap in the tailgate, but the Jin was already behind them, and the road was curving toward the center of town. She sat with the number in her mind. 31. And that was only the vehicles she could see from the truck bed at the angle she was sitting. The actual number was higher. And this was one factory on the edge of one small town in Texas. The county road from camp had passed other factories, other businesses, other establishments with their own parking arrangements. The parking lot at the Cotton Gin was not an exception. It was simply the one she had been positioned to count. She opened her notebook on her knee and wrote, 31 private vehicles. Cotton factory. Workers. Then she looked at what she had written and added, Tuesday. The truck slowed and turned onto Main Street and stopped in front of a building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Dottie's Lunch in red letters on a white background, and below it, in smaller letters, open 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., hot coffee always. Hannah put the notebook in her coat pocket and climbed down from the truck. Through the window, she could see the counter, 12 stools, a menu board on the wall with items written in chalk, a coffee urn at the end that was already going, its steam catching the morning light from the window. A woman in an apron was wiping the counter with a cloth, moving with the efficiency of someone who had opened this place every morning for a long time and had reduced the preparation to its essential sequence. The woman looked up through the glass and saw Hannah standing on the sidewalk. She did not smile or wave. She simply looked, with the calm assessment of someone who has been told to expect a thing and is confirming its arrival. Then she went back to wiping the counter. Hannah pushed open the door and went in. The bell above the door rang once, clearly, in the particular tone of a bell that has been rung 10,000 times and still means what it always meant. Someone is here. The day has started. There is work to do. Dottie Calloway set the cloth on the counter and pulled an apron from the hook beside the coffee urn and held it out. She said, "You know how to pour coffee?" Denton translated from the doorway. Hannah said, "Yes." Dottie said, "Good. That's most of it." She nodded at the coffee urn. "Cups are on the left. Customers sit where they like. If they want the menu, they'll ask. If they don't ask, they already know what they want." She picked up her cloth and went back to the counter. Hannah tied the apron behind her back and stood for a moment in the small, warm space that smelled of coffee and something frying in the kitchen and the faint sweetness of the pie under the glass dome at the end of the counter. She looked at the menu board. She counted the items without meaning to. 12. All available. On a Tuesday in June in a country that had been at war for 18 months. She picked up the coffee pot and waited for the first customer to come through the door. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. The first customer arrived at 6:15. Hannah heard him before she saw him. The screen door, the boot on the step, the particular sound of a man who moves through a familiar space without adjusting his weight for it. He came in the way people come into places they have been coming into for years, without looking at the door or the stools or the menu board, because none of those things required his attention anymore. He sat at the third stool from the left, set his hat on the counter beside him, and looked at the coffee urn with the patient expression of a man who had already decided what he wanted before he left his house. Hannah poured his coffee before he asked. He looked at her with mild surprise, not at who she was, but at the speed of the coffee, and then nodded once in the way of someone acknowledging a competent act, which was different from thanking for it, and also somehow more satisfying. His name, she would learn, was Harold Briggs. He farmed wheat on 400 acres northeast of town. He was 63 years old and had opinions about the federal government that he delivered with the even-handed certainty of a man who considered civic complaint a form of participation rather than a sign of weakness. He came in every weekday morning at 6:15 and every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. He ordered coffee and whatever pie Dottie had made that morning, and he ate the pie with the focused appreciation of someone who understood that good pie was not guaranteed and should not be taken for granted. He did not, in those first weeks, speak to Hannah directly. Not from hostility. She could see there was none. He spoke to the counter, to his coffee cup, to Dottie when she came through from the kitchen, to whoever happened to be sitting on the adjacent stool. He spoke the way people speak in places they consider extensions of their own living rooms, with the comfortable imprecision of someone who is not performing for an audience, but simply thinking out loud in the presence of other people. On her third morning, Hannah caught enough of his words to understand that he was complaining about a Department of Agriculture inspector who had visited his farm the previous week. The complaint was specific and detailed and entirely unafraid. He used the word incompetent twice and the phrase doesn't know wheat from his elbow once. He said the man should go back to Washington and stay there. He said this while Hannah refilled his coffee, and a man 2 stools down laughed and said he had the same inspector and the same opinion. Neither man lowered his voice. Neither man looked toward the door. Hannah carried the coffee pot back to the urn and stood for a moment with her back to the counter. In Cologne, in 1941, the mathematics teacher at the secondary school 2 streets from her apartment had been taken away for something someone said he had said at a dinner party. The details were not clear. They were never clear, which was part of the architecture of it. But the outcome was specific and permanent. His classes were reassigned. His name was removed from the school's staff board. Within a week, the habit of not mentioning him had established itself so completely that Hannah could not have said, 2 months later, whether she had ever actually known him or only known of him. Harold Briggs finished his pie and left 2 coins on the counter and walked out. Hannah looked at the coins. She picked them up and brought them to Dottie, who was at the kitchen pass-through with an order slip. Dottie looked at the coins and then at Hannah. She said, "That's yours." Hannah said, in the careful English she was assembling word by word, "He forget?" Dottie looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a conversation. "No, he left it for you. For the service. That's what people do here." She took the order slip from the wheel and went back into the kitchen. "Put it in your apron pocket." Hannah stood at the pass-through with the 2 coins in her palm. She looked at them for a longer moment than the situation seemed to require. Then she put them in her apron pocket and went back to the counter. The morning rush at Dottie's lunch lasted from 6 until 8:30 and consisted of between 8 and 14 customers, depending on the day and the weather and the particular agricultural rhythms of Robertson County that Hannah did not yet understand, but was beginning to learn. They came in mostly alone or in pairs, sat at the counter rather than the 2 small tables along the wall, ordered from memory rather than the board, and ate with the focused efficiency of people who had work waiting. The menu board had 12 items. Hannah had read it on the first morning and read it again on the second because she could not quite believe it was the same board. Eggs 3 ways. Biscuits with gravy. Oatmeal. 2 kinds of toast. Grits, which she did not recognize and asked Denton about. And he said it was ground corn cooked soft, and she said that did not sound like 12 items worth, and he said she should try it before she decided. All 12 items were available every morning. This was not a board that listed aspirations. It listed what was actually in the kitchen, prepared or preparable, available to whoever came through the door with the coins for it. In Cologne, by 1942, the bakery on her street had been open 3 days a week. The bread had been available until it was gone, which was usually before 9. The lines had begun before dawn and contained people who carried their own bags and did not make eye contact with each other because eye contact in a rationing line had a complicated social grammar that required more energy than anyone had available. She thought about this while she refilled coffee cups. She thought about it again at 8 o'clock when Dottie came out of the kitchen with a fresh pan of biscuits and set them in the warmer without any particular announcement, because the biscuits were not a scarcity event, but simply the next batch, and next batches were what happened here when the previous batch ran out. She wrote in her notebook that evening, "Biscuits replaced when gone." No announcement. More simply exist. She looked at what she had written and then wrote beneath it. The assumption here is continuation. Things will continue to be available. This is not assumed at home. Has not been assumed for years. She closed the notebook and sat on her bunk and listened to the Texas night outside the storm panel and thought about the word assumption and what it meant to live inside one rather than outside it. By the second week, she knew the regulars well enough to have them memorized without trying to. Harold, with his government opinions, arriving at 6:15, had on the counter coffee before he asked. Walt Greer, the retired postal worker, who came in at 7 every day with his reading glasses already on, and a newspaper folded to whatever page he had been reading when he left his house. Walt read while he ate, which meant he did not require conversation, which Hannah found restful. He tipped 15 cents regardless of what he ordered, with the mechanical consistency of a man who had decided on an amount and saw no reason to recalculate. The Dempsey brothers, Ray and Calvin, who farmed together and arrived together and finished each other's sentences with the easy familiarity of people who had been doing it their whole lives. They were in their 40s. Both large and unhurried, and they teased Dottie about her pie crusts with the comfortable regularity of a long-running joke whose punchline no longer mattered because the performance of it was the point. Mrs. Elaine Fogarty, who came in at 7:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always sat at the far end of the counter, always ordered the oatmeal with extra brown sugar, and always brought a list of something: shopping, church business, the organizational infrastructure of a life run with considerable administrative precision. She was perhaps 60, small and direct, with the manner of a woman who had been running things for so long that running things had become indistinguishable from breathing. And there was the jukebox. It stood against the wall beside the second small table, a Wurlitzer with a curved top and colored lights along the selector panel that caught the morning sun from the window and threw small red and gold patches across the floor. It cost a nickel to play, and the selection will held 42 songs, and approximately every 40 minutes between 7 and noon someone dropped a nickel in without particular deliberation, and the music started. The first time it happened, Hannah was behind the counter with the coffee pot, and the opening notes of a swing number came through the speaker with the bright, unashamedly pleasured energy of music that had been constructed specifically to make the body want to move. She recognized the sound. Not the song. She did not know the song, but the genre. She knew it as the music that had been labeled in Germany with the clinical contempt reserved for things the Reich needed people to fear. Needler music. Degenerate. Corrupting. A form of cultural poison dressed as entertainment. She had never actually heard it until now. Dottie, coming through the pass-through with 2 plates, was humming along. Not performing. Not making a point. Simply humming the way people hum music they like when they are carrying plates from a kitchen to a counter, and their hands are full, and the song is in their head, and there is no reason not to. Hannah set the coffee pot down and listened for a moment. The music was not what she had been told it was. It was not chaotic or threatening or morally dissolving. It was a trumpet and a piano and a rhythm section doing something complicated that sounded effortless, which was, she would come to understand, the specific achievement of that kind of music, the concealment of its own difficulty behind the surface of pleasure. It made the room larger somehow. It made the morning feel like something worth being present in. She picked up the coffee pot and went back to work. But she wrote in her notebook that evening, the music, played freely, by anyone. Dottie hummed it. Nobody arrested. The third week brought a development she had not anticipated. She began to understand what people were saying without waiting for Denton to translate. Not everything. Not the fast, overlapping conversation of Harold and the Dempsey brothers arguing about sorghum prices, which moved too quickly and contained too many specific terms she did not have. But the general shape of things, the complaints, the requests, the ordinary social exchanges of a lunch counter where people came because the coffee was good, and the pie was Dottie's, and the stool was familiar. She understood, on a Wednesday morning, that Harold was describing a visit from the same Department of Agriculture inspector from the week before. She understood that Harold had told the man, in direct and specific terms, what he thought of the department's crop allocation policy, and what the man could do with the form he had brought for Harold to sign. She understood, from the way Harold told it, leaning back slightly on his stool, arms crossed, with the satisfied expression of a man reviewing a thing he is proud of, that this confrontation had gone entirely in Harold's favor and that the inspector had left without the signed form. She waited until the lunch rush was over and Denton was having his afternoon coffee at the end of the counter. She said, "Harold, the government man." Nothing happened to Harold. Denton looked at her over his cup. "What do you mean, nothing happened?" She looked for the words. He argued. With a government official. He refused to sign. Nothing happened after. Denton set his cup down slowly. He had the expression of a man receiving a question whose premise he is only now understanding. "Harold does that about twice a year," he said. "He's been doing it since the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He writes letters too. To his congressman." He paused. "That's sort of the point. That's how it's supposed to work," Hannah said. "And the congressman reads the letters?" "Sometimes he writes back," Denton said. "Depends on the congressman." She looked at the counter for a moment. Then she picked up her cloth and wiped a section that was already clean. That evening Walt Greer left his newspaper on the counter when he stood to go, the way he sometimes did when he had finished with it, in the casual understanding that someone else might want it. Hannah picked it up after he left. Her English was not sufficient for everything, but she could read the headlines, and the headlines of the Hearn Democrat that Wednesday contained, above the fold, an editorial about the local government's handling of road repair contracts that used the word incompetent in the first paragraph and unacceptable in the third. The newspaper had been printed that morning. It was available at the counter. Anyone could read it. She put it under the counter and took it back to camp in her coat pocket and read it that evening with her dictionary, slowly, translating sentence by sentence, making notes in the margin. In the morning she put it on the counter for whoever wanted it next. On the Friday of the third week, 4 women came in together at 11:30 and took the 2 small tables they pushed together, which Dottie allowed because the counter was quiet, and she had known 3 of them since grammar school. They ordered coffee and the soup and a plate of biscuits to share, and then spread papers across the table, and began what was clearly an organizational meeting of some kind. Their voices carrying the particular energy of people conducting the practical administration of a project they believe in. Hannah refilled their coffee twice. She caught fragments. Christmas, packages, how many men in the compound? Reverend Mills said the choir would, the Legion Post already confirmed. She caught the word German and then heard it again and understood, on the third hearing, that the project they were administering was a Christmas donation drive for Camp Hearn. For the prisoners. She stood at the coffee urn with the pot in her hand and listened. The woman nearest her, she would learn later that her name was Clara Hess, no relation, a farmer's wife with 3 children and a husband in the Navy, was arguing with the woman across the table about whether to include cigarettes in the individual packages. She said some of the men didn't smoke and it was a waste. The woman across the table said that even men who didn't smoke could trade cigarettes for other things, and it was practical. Clara said that was encouraging a black market. The other woman said it was encouraging resourcefulness. They went back and forth on this with the comfortable vigor of people who argued because they respected each other's arguments. And then Clara said fine, include the cigarettes, and wrote something on her list. Nobody had asked them to do this. There was no government form requiring it. There was no social pressure making it the expected thing. For women had decided that enemy prisoners should have a proper Christmas and were spending their Friday lunch hour organizing the logistics of making it happen because that was the kind of women they had decided to be. Hannah brought the biscuit plate to the table and set it down, and Clara Hess looked up and smiled at her with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who has too much on her list to have energy left over for complication. Thank you, honey, she said. Hannah said, you are welcome. She went back to the counter. She stood there for a moment with the empty biscuit plate in her hand, and the sound of 4 women planning Christmas for their enemies filling the small room, and the jukebox playing something slow and warm in the corner, and the afternoon sun coming through the window, and catching the colored panels of the Wurlitzer, and throwing its small patches of red and gold across the floor. She put the plate down and picked up her cloth and wiped the counter. In her notebook that evening she wrote, for women, lunch hour, planning Christmas for the camp. Nobody told them to. Nobody is watching to confirm they did. She looked at what she had written for a long time. Then she wrote one more line beneath it. This is what it looks like when a thing is chosen rather than required. She closed the notebook and put it in her coat pocket beside the 2 hair clips and lay down in the Texas night and listened to the camp settling around her, and felt, without announcing it even to herself, that something in the room of her understanding had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific way of furniture that has been in the wrong position for a long time and has finally been moved 2 inches to the left, which is all it takes to change how the whole room feels. July arrived in Robertson County with the patience of something that has been here before and intends to stay. The heat was different from anything Hannah had known in Germany. Not sharper, exactly, but more committed, the heat of a place that had negotiated its relationship with summer over geological time and arrived at an arrangement that prioritized the heat's preferences. By 7 in the morning the air outside the camp barracks had the density of something almost solid. By noon the sidewalk on Main Street held the warmth of the previous hour and the hour before that, accumulating it the way a stone accumulates warmth, radiating it back from below while the sun continued from above. Inside Dottie's lunch, the ceiling fan turned at the pace of something that had given up on urgency and settled for circulation, moving the warm air in slow repetitions that were more psychological comfort than physical relief. The screen door stayed open from 6 until closing, admitting whatever breeze the day offered along with the occasional insect that Dottie dispatched with a rolled newspaper she kept behind the coffee urn for exactly this purpose. Hannah had been at the counter for 5 weeks. She knew the distance from the coffee urn to the far end of the counter and steps, because she had walked it several hundred times. She knew that the third stool had a slight wobble on its left leg that Harold had never commented on because Harold sat on it every morning and had presumably decided the wobble was not worth the conversation. She knew that the soup on Tuesdays was always vegetable and on Thursdays was whatever Dottie felt like, which was usually something with chicken. She knew that the jukebox ran through its 42 songs and cycled back, and that the song in position 7 was a slow number with a piano introduction that made the room go briefly quieter when it played, as though the customers felt it required a different quality of attention. Her English had been improving in the specific way that language improves when it is used for real purposes rather than practiced in controlled conditions. She did not yet have the language for everything. There were still conversations that moved too fast, idioms that arrived without warning, references to things she had no context for. But she had the language for the counter. For the coffee, and the pie, and the biscuits, and the soup, and the small, Regular exchanges of a place where people came because they were hungry and left because they were fed, and the distance between those two states was managed by a counter and a coffee pot, and the particular social contract of a lunch establishment where everyone understood their role. She had also, by the 5th week, accumulated 47 cents in tips. This was not a large amount. It was, in fact, a quite small amount by the standards of what she had observed other servers receive in the establishments she had glimpsed in the town during transport. But she had not been counting toward a total. She had been counting because counting was her nature, and because each coin represented something she was still in the process of understanding, and understanding required inventory. She kept them in the small tin that had once contained throat lozenges, and that she had found empty on the supply shelf at camp, and kept because it was useful. The coins went in at the end of each day, added to the previous day's coins, and she did not spend them because spending them would have required deciding what they were for, and she had not decided yet. Walt Greer arrived at 7 on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of July with his newspaper already folded to the letters page, which was unusual. He normally read front to back with the methodical patience of someone processing a document rather than seeking specific information. He sat at his usual stool and spread the paper on the counter and read 2 letters with the focused attention of someone who has a stake in their content. Hannah poured his coffee. He said, without looking up, "Thank you, Hannah." He had started using her name somewhere in the 3rd week, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who considered knowing the name of the person who poured his coffee a basic courtesy. Several of the regulars had followed, with varying degrees of promptness. Harold had taken the longest. He had referred to her as her for 2 weeks before switching to her name, and when he switched he did it without announcement, as though he had simply revised a notation in a ledger. Walt read his letters, and then folded the paper back to the front page and set it to one side, and ate his oatmeal with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been eating oatmeal at this counter for years and had no complaints about it. At the end of his meal, he did something Hannah had not seen before. He produced an envelope from his shirt pocket, a proper letter-sized envelope, already addressed, already stamped, and unfolded a paper napkin from the dispenser at the counter and began writing on it with the stub of a pencil he kept behind his ear. He wrote for several minutes in the compact, precise handwriting of someone trained in a formal system, covering most of the napkin in closely spaced lines. Hannah refilled his coffee and read enough over his shoulder to understand that he was composing a complaint. Something about road repairs. The county road south of Miller's Creek, which he had traveled on twice, and which had a section near the low bridge that pulled the truck sideways when Denton drove through it too fast. Walt was writing about this road with the focused civic energy of a man who understood that roads were not an act of nature, but a responsibility, and that responsibility required accountability, and accountability required someone to write it down and send it somewhere. He finished the napkin, read it back to himself, made 2 small corrections, then picked up the envelope and extracted a folded letter from inside it. An actual letter, already written, and added 2 lines to the bottom, transferring the key points from the napkin. He returned the letter to the envelope, pressed the flap down, and set it on the counter beside his coffee cup with the satisfied finality of a task completed. Hannah said, carefully, "For the congressman?" Walt looked up with mild surprise. Not that she had spoken, but that she had known what it was. "That's right. Senator, actually. Though I copy the congressman too." He tapped the envelope. "County road south of Miller's Creek. The low bridge section. Been bad since March, and they've had the contract money since April." He picked up his coffee. "3rd letter on this subject. I intend to keep writing until something happens or someone explains to me why something isn't going to happen." Hannah said, "And they answer?" "Usually," Walt said. "Not always. But usually." He finished his coffee. "A man who doesn't answer his mail doesn't get elected twice. They know that." He left 15 cents on the counter and walked out with his letter and his newspaper under his arm. Hannah stood at the counter and thought about a mathematics teacher who had been taken away for something someone said he said at a dinner party, and about a retired postal worker in Texas who was on his 3rd letter to his senator about a road, and about the distance between those 2 facts, which was not a distance that could be measured in kilometers or years. She picked up Walt's coffee cup and brought it to the basin. She wrote in her notebook that evening, "Walt. 3rd letter about the road. Senator answers. Congressman copies. No consequences for writing. No consequences for complaining. The complaint is the mechanism. The mechanism works because everyone understands it is supposed to." She paused, and then added, "At home the mechanism was different. The mechanism was silence. Silence kept you safe. Here silence is apparently optional." The church women came back on a Friday in the 2nd week of July. This time there were 5 of them, Clara Hess again, and 3 of the same women from the previous visit, and a new one Hannah did not recognize, perhaps 45, with the organized efficiency of someone who had been added to a committee because she was known to get things done. They took the same two tables pushed together and spread their papers with the practiced ease of a group that had met like this before and would meet like this again. The Christmas drive had apparently grown since the previous meeting. Hannah understood enough now to follow the conversation without translation. The camp population had been confirmed at 4,800 prisoners. The package count target had been revised upward. The American Legion post had increased their commitment. More cigarettes, candy, sports equipment. The Methodist choir was confirmed for the Christmas concert and had begun learning the German carols, which Clara said was going better than expected, and the new one, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, said she was not surprised because her choir had a good ear. Hannah placed this information in the column she kept in her head alongside everything else she had been filing for 5 weeks. The American Legion was an organization of veterans, men who had fought in a previous war, men who had in some cases fought Germans in a previous war, and they were donating cigarettes and candy to current German prisoners because it was Christmas, and that was the kind of organization they had decided to be. She refilled the coffee cups, and Clara Hess looked up and said, "How are you settling in, honey? You finding your way around okay?" Hannah said, "Yes. Thank you." Clara said, "Dottie treating you right?" Hannah said, "Yes. She is good." Clara nodded with the satisfied expression of someone confirming something they already believed. "She's a good woman. Known her 30 years. She looked at her list. "You know, if you ever want to come to services on a Sunday, First Methodist is open to everyone. Reverend Mills doesn't make distinctions." She said it the way she said most things, practically, without drama, as one item of useful information among several. Then she went back to her list. Hannah carried the coffee pot back to the urn. She stood for a moment with her back to the counter. An invitation to church, extended to a German prisoner of war, in the middle of a war, by a woman who was simultaneously organizing Christmas donations for the prisoners' camp, whose husband was in the Navy, and who had 30 years of friendship with the woman who had handed Hannah an apron and pointed her at the coffee urn. Extended with the same tone she might use to recommend a hardware store or a route to the county road. It was not a performance. It was not a demonstration. It was simply what Clara Hess did when she knew a person who might not know something useful. Hannah poured herself a small cup of coffee, which Dottie permitted during the slow periods, and drank it standing at the urn and looked at the colored lights of the jukebox, and thought about the word everyone in the phrase open to everyone, and how long it had been since she had heard that word used without a list of exceptions following it. The afternoon regulars were a different population from the morning ones. The farmers came in the morning, between tasks, with the specific hunger of people who had been up since before dawn and had hours of work still ahead. The afternoon brought a slower current. Shopkeepers on their breaks, women in from errands, the occasional traveler who had stopped on the county road and found the hot coffee always seemed persuasive. On a Thursday afternoon in late July, a man Hannah had not seen before came in and sat at the counter and ordered coffee in the pie. He was perhaps 50, in a suit that had been good once and was still respectable. With a leather briefcase he sat on the floor beside his stool with the practiced care of someone who carried it everywhere. He had the air of a man passing through rather than arriving, someone with another destination who was using Hearn as an interval. He drank his coffee and ate his pie and then opened the briefcase and took out a sheaf of papers and began reading them with the focused attention of someone reviewing documents for a decision that has not yet been made. He made notes in the margins. He crossed out 2 sections and rewrote them in smaller handwriting above the crossed-out parts. Harold came in at his usual afternoon time and sat 2 stools down. The man with the briefcase looked up at Harold's arrival with the mild alertness of a person who notices things. Harold looked at the briefcase the way farmers look at things that belong to offices, with polite skepticism. They talked. Hannah followed most of it. The man with the briefcase was from Austin. He was something in the Department of Agriculture, not the inspector Harold had complained about, a different office, something to do with county allocations. He had stopped in Hearn on his way to a meeting in Bryan. Harold had opinions about county allocations. He delivered them. The man from Austin listened with the careful attention of someone whose job required him to listen to farmers, which meant he had developed the specific skill of receiving complaint without deflection, following the argument to its conclusion, and responding to its actual content rather than its emotional temperature. He pushed back on 2 of Harold's points with specific figures that Harold did not have. Harold conceded the figures and adjusted his complaint accordingly. The man from Austin said that one of Harold's underlying points was correct and that it was something his office was aware of. Harold said that being aware of it and doing something about it were different things. The man from Austin said that was fair and wrote something in the margin of his papers. They parted, if not in agreement, then in the specific mutual respect of 2 people who had argued honestly and neither had required the other to pretend the argument was over when it wasn't. The man from Austin left a good tip. Harold left his usual 2 coins and his hat impression on the counter and walked out talking to himself about sorghum allocations. Hannah wiped the counter and thought about the mathematics teacher again. She thought about him with a frequency that surprised her, not with grief exactly, but with the specific discomfort of a person who has been carrying a question they did not know they were carrying and has only recently noticed its weight. She thought about the difference between a country where a farmer could argue with a government official over pie and be taken seriously and a country where a teacher could be taken away for something someone said he said at a dinner party. And she thought about what kind of conditions produced each of those outcomes, and what you had to believe, collectively, to live inside one rather than the other. She did not arrive at a clean conclusion. She was not, by temperament, a person who arrived at clean conclusions before the evidence was complete. But she was a person who recognized when evidence was accumulating, and the evidence at the counter of Dottie's lunch in Hearne, Texas was accumulating with the patient consistency of interest compounding in a ledger, small amounts, daily, adding up to something larger than any single entry suggested. On a Saturday morning in early August, a young soldier came in with his girl. They were perhaps 20 and 19 respectively, and they sat at the far table rather than the counter with the instinct of people who wanted a degree of privacy that stools did not provide. They ordered coffee and split a piece of pie and talked in the low, slightly urgent way of people who had limited time together and were trying to make the most of what they had without letting the effort show. The soldier was in uniform, Army, a private's insignia, with the specific quality of youth that made the uniform look like something he was still growing into. The girl had her hand on the table close to his without quite touching it, the hand of someone who wanted contact but was managing herself in a public space. They were laughing at something when Hannah brought their coffee, and neither of them stopped laughing or lowered their voices or adjusted themselves for her presence. The soldier said thank you without looking up, still laughing at whatever the girl had said, and the girl looked at Hannah directly and smiled with the easy warmth of someone who was too happy at that moment to manage the size of her expression. Hannah set the coffee down and went back to the counter. She watched them from the corner of her eye while she wiped the counter, not intrusively, the way you watch things at the periphery of your attention when something in them is working on you without your permission. The soldier had been sent somewhere. That was obvious. He was home on leave, or about to leave, or had just arrived. She could not tell the direction from the way they held themselves, but the temporary quality of the morning was clear in everything they did. The way they spoke as though time was a resource being spent rather than an ambient condition. The way the girl looked at him when he wasn't watching, with the particular attention of someone memorizing. At the end of their coffee, the soldier reached into his pocket and left coins on the table, more than the cost of the coffee and the pie. He stacked them with a small, unconscious care, and then stood and held the girl's coat for her, and they went out through the screen door into the August morning. Hannah collected the coins. She stood at the table for a moment with the coins in her palm. The pie plate still had a smear of cherry filling on it. The 2 coffee cups were not quite empty. The table had the warm, inhabited quality of a space that had recently held something worth having. She put the coins in her apron pocket and carried the plates to the basin and thought about the girl's expression when she smiled. Uncomplicated and direct, the smile of someone who had not yet learned to manage the size of her feelings in case they revealed something that could be used against her. She thought, this is what it looks like when people are not afraid of being seen. She wrote nothing in her notebook that evening. Some things, she was finding, were more accurately kept in a different kind of storage, not in columns or observations, but somewhere below the level of language, in the place where understanding lives before it becomes words. August passed into September with the slow reluctance of Texas summers that have established themselves too thoroughly to leave without negotiation. The heat did not break so much as gradually concede, retreating by degrees through September mornings that were still warm but carried, by 7 o'clock, the first suggestion of something different coming from the north, a quality in the air that was less about temperature than about intention, the way a room feels when a window has been opened in another part of the house. The fields around Hearne had moved through their summer cycle, and the cotton was coming in now. The gin across the road from Dottie's running at full capacity. Its parking lot as full at 6 in the morning as it had been in June. The same rows of personal vehicles arranged with the same casual permanence of things that belonged where they were. Hannah had stopped counting the cars. She was aware of this. The way you are aware of a habit you no longer perform. Its absence more noticeable in retrospect than its presence had been. She had counted them every morning from the truck bed for 11 weeks. The inventory instinct of a bookkeeper applied to a phenomenon she needed to quantify before she could process it. And then one morning in late August she had looked at the parking lot and not counted, and had not noticed she wasn't counting until they were past it, which meant the counting was over not because she had decided to stop, but because she had finished needing to. She understood, now, what the parking lot meant. Not just as a data point. 31 vehicles, personal property, ordinary workers, but as an expression of something structural. A society that produced parking lots full of workers' personal cars was a society that had decided, at some level below policy and above accident, that the people who ran its machines should have enough to own the means of getting to them. That workers were not a resource to be maximized at the point of extraction, but people with lives that continued after the shift ended and required, like all lives, the basic infrastructure of continuation. This was not, she understood now, an accidental outcome. She thought about this on the mornings when Denton drove past the gin and she watched the lot without counting it. And she thought about the ledger she had kept in Cologne where the numbers for workers' allocations had appeared in columns alongside the numbers for materials and equipment, the same category, the same font, the same implicit understanding of what a body was for. May Hollis came into Dottie's for the first time on a Friday in the last week of August. Hannah noticed her the way she noticed everyone. Inventory before interaction, the habit of a person trained to assess a room. May was perhaps 50, though she could have been older or younger depending on the light and the angle. She had the quality of a woman who had been handsome rather than beautiful and had arrived at an age where the distinction no longer interested her. Her hair was gray at the temples and brown elsewhere, and she wore it pinned back with a clip similar to the two Hannah carried in her coat pocket, which Hannah noticed and filed without knowing why. She sat at the middle of the counter, not Harold's stool, which had developed a social designation that the regulars honored without discussing, and ordered coffee and the soup with the quiet decisiveness of someone who had considered the board and made a choice rather than defaulting to a habit. She ate without reading and without looking at the other customers, not from unfriendliness but from the contained quality of someone who had come in because they needed to be around people and had brought enough of their own interior company that conversation was not required. She left a tip, 12 cents, which was above average for a soup and coffee, and went out. The following Friday she came back. Same stool, same order, same quiet self-sufficiency. She looked at Hannah when Hannah poured her coffee with a directness that was neither warm nor cold, but simply present. The look of a person who sees who is in front of them and has made a preliminary assessment that requires no adjustment. On the third Friday she said, "You're from the camp." It was not a question. Hannah said, "Yes." May said, "How long have you been here?" Hannah said, "Since June." May nodded once, the nod of someone filing information. She drank her coffee and ate her soup and left her 12 cents and went out. Hannah watched her go and then looked at the coins on the counter and then picked them up and put them in her tin. September brought a change to the customer pattern that Hannah had not anticipated. The cotton harvest drew workers from surrounding counties, and some of those workers found Dottie's on their lunch breaks. Men she had not seen before, in different boots and different hats, with the slightly disoriented quality of people navigating an unfamiliar town. They were mostly respectful, mostly unremarkable, ordering from the board with the practical efficiency of people who had limited time and needed calories. But one afternoon in the second week of September, two men came in who were louder than the room required and sat at the counter and spoke to each other with the comfortable assumption of people accustomed to being the dominant presence in whatever space they occupied. They were not cruel, exactly. They were simply the kind of men who had not been required, by the specific conditions of their lives, to develop the habit of adjusting their volume or their assumptions for the people around them. One of them looked at Hannah when she poured his coffee and said something she caught only partially, something about the camp, something about Germans, with an edge she recognized without needing to translate it precisely. Dottie came through the pass-through at the exact moment it needed her. She set two plates on the counter without looking at the men and said in the even, carrying voice she used when she needed the room to hear something, "Hannah's working my counter. You want lunch, she'll bring it. You don't. The door's the same one you came in." She went back into the kitchen. The man looked at his plate. He picked up his fork and ate his lunch. He left a smaller tip than average, but he left one. Hannah refilled his coffee at the end without being asked, because that was what you did at a lunch counter, and he said thank you without making anything of it, which was the most honest interaction they had managed. She wrote nothing about this in her notebook. There was nothing to analyze. Dottie had said a thing that needed to be said, and the room had absorbed it, and continued. But she carried the moment in a different way, not in the ledger column of accumulating evidence, but in the specific place where things go when they demonstrate, simply and without drama, the existence of a value being actively held rather than merely professed. Hannah's working my counter. 5 words. Dottie had not said, "She is a prisoner." She had not said, "Be respectful to our German worker." She had said, "She is working my counter," which placed Hannah in exactly the same category as anyone else Dottie had ever hired. A person who was here because she was good at the job and whose presence required no further justification. May Hollis came in on the fourth Friday of September and sat at her usual stool and ordered her usual soup and coffee. But before the soup arrived, she did something different. She unfolded a letter she took from her coat pocket and read it at the counter, slowly, with the focused attention of someone reading a document they have already read several times and are reading again to make sure it still says what they remember. She folded it back and put it in her pocket and sat for a moment with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the middle distance. Hannah brought the soup and set it down. May looked up and said, "My son is in the Pacific. I got a letter this week." She paused. "He's all right. Still all right." Hannah said, "I am glad." May looked at her for a moment, a longer moment than the exchange required, the look of a person deciding something. Then she nodded and picked up her spoon. She ate her soup and drank her coffee, and when she was done, she placed her coins on the counter. 12 cents, as always. Then she placed 2 more coins beside them, slowly, deliberately, as though each one represented a considered decision. She said, "I figure somebody over there is being decent to my boy. I don't know who. I don't know where exactly he is, or what's happening to him." She looked at the coins. "But I figure somebody somewhere is treating him like a person and not an enemy. And the least I can do is return the consideration in whatever direction it's available." She picked up her coat and stood. "Keep the change, honey," she said. Not to the coins, not to the counter, to Hannah. Direct, without theater, with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who has decided a thing and is carrying it out. She went out through the screen door. The bell rang once, clearly, in the tone it had had for 10,000 openings. Hannah stood at the counter. She looked at the coins, 14 cents, arranged in the small specific pattern May had left them in. 2 coins beside 12, the 2 added slowly and with intention. She looked at them for long enough that Dottie came through the pass-through and saw her standing there, and did not say anything, and went back into the kitchen, because Dottie had been running a lunch counter for 20 years and understood that some moments required the courtesy of not being interrupted. The room was quiet. Harold had gone. Walt had gone. The afternoon current had not yet arrived. The jukebox was between songs, the particular silence of a room that has recently had music in it and has not yet decided whether to have more. Hannah picked up the 14 cents and held them in her palm. They were not, by any objective measure, a significant amount. They were not a grand gesture or a sacrifice or a formal act of reconciliation between nations. They were coins left on a counter by a woman who had a son somewhere in the Pacific and had decided that the person in front of her deserved the same consideration she hoped a stranger was extending to him. The logic of it was so simple, it almost hurt. Not charity. Not pity. Not the performance of democratic values for an audience. Just the basic, horizontal human calculation that the person who served you was worth something. And that worth could be expressed in the small, concrete language of coins on a counter. A language that required no translation and made no claims, and carried no ideology beyond the one built into the gesture itself, which was, "You are here, and you helped me, and that matters." Hannah thought about the allocation ledgers in Cologne, about the columns where workers appeared alongside materials and equipment, about the specific font that made no distinction between a human body and a machine part, about the years she had spent entering numbers in those columns without asking what the columns meant, because the columns were not the kind of thing you asked about. She thought about the parking lot at the Cotton Gin, and the menu board with 12 items, and Harold's voice filling the room with opinions nobody could confiscate, and Walt's letters to his senator about a road, and 4 church women organizing Christmas for their enemies on a Friday lunch hour because they had decided to. She thought about Dottie saying she's working my counter in the voice that required no further argument. She thought about May Hollis reading a letter from her son who was still alive, still all right, somewhere she couldn't name, and leaving 2 extra coins beside 12 because somebody somewhere was being decent, and decency moved in whatever direction it was available. Hannah put the coins in her apron pocket. She picked up her cloth and wiped the counter. The long familiar motion from one end to the other, the motion she had made several hundred times since June in this small warm room that smelled of coffee and pie, and the particular combination of lives that moved through it daily and left their specific impressions on the air. She wiped the counter and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was not relief, though there was something in it that resembled the feeling of setting down a weight you had been carrying so long you had stopped noticing it had a shape. It was not joy, though the room felt lighter than it had a few minutes before in a way she could not entirely account for. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a person who has been handed, through the accumulation of small and ordinary things, a parking lot, a tip, a menu board, a letter to a senator, a church choir learning German carols, 2 coins placed beside 12 with deliberate care, the evidence that her understanding of the world had been constructed on a foundation that did not reflect the world. Not in a single dramatic moment of revelation. Not through argument or instruction or the formal presentation of evidence. Through a screen door and a coffee pot and a jukebox playing music nobody had arrested anyone for, and a woman who figured somebody somewhere was being decent to her son. She wiped the counter from one end to the other. She did not cry at the counter. She was not a person who cried in front of people without an extremely compelling reason, and the lunch counter of Dottie's lunch on a quiet Thursday afternoon was not a place she intended to provide that reason. She cried in the truck on the way back to camp, in the back of the flatbed with 2 other women from a different work detail who were tired and looking at the sky and not at her. The Texas landscape moved past on both sides in the late September light, the cotton fields stripped now and the soil exposed and dark in the long shadow of the afternoon, and the sky above it going from pale to gold at the horizon in the slow, deliberate way of skies that have enough room to do the thing properly. Sergeant Denton drove with his eyes on the road. If he heard anything from the truck bed, he gave no sign of it. He was a man who understood that the road required his attention, and that the distance between camp and town was sometimes longer for some passengers than for others, and that the courtesy in such situations was the road. Hannah looked at the sky and let the motion of the truck take whatever needed to go and kept the rest, which was most of it, and by the time they reached the camp gate, she had her face in order and her hands in her lap and 14 cents in her apron pocket, and a question she had been carrying since 1939 that had finally, without announcement, found its answer. Not in a speech. Not in a document. In coins on a counter from a woman who had a son in the Pacific and had decided that decency moved in whatever direction it was available. That was all. That was everything. October came to Robertson County like a decision that had been made quietly and was only now being announced. The mornings were different first. Not cold. Not yet. But carrying a quality of air that had not been there in September, something thinner and cleaner that arrived before dawn and lingered until the sun had been up long enough to reassert the summer's residual claim on the land. The cotton fields were stripped and dark. The wheat fields were waiting. The sky had shifted from the pale committed blue of deep summer to something higher and more transparent. The blue of a season that was gathering itself rather than spending itself, and the light that came through Dottie's window in the morning had changed its angle enough that the colored panels of the jukebox caught it differently, throwing their small patches of red and gold onto a different section of floor than they had in July. Hannah noticed this the way she noticed everything now, not as inventory, but as experience, the difference between a person who counts what is in a room and a person who inhabits it. She had been at the counter for 4 months. The tin of tip coins in her bunk had 41 items in it now, accumulated with the patient consistency of daily small amounts that added to something larger than any single addition suggested. She still did not spend them. Not from hoarding instinct. She was not, by nature, a hoarder, but because the coins had become something other than currency somewhere around the 5th week, when she understood what they meant, and spending them on camp canteen items would have converted them back into the simpler thing they had started as. She was not ready for that. She had filled 2/3 of the notebook. May Hollis came in every Friday through October. The letters from the Pacific arrived with irregular frequency, sometimes 2 in a week, sometimes 3 weeks between them. And Hannah learned to read May's quality of presence when she came through the door, the particular texture of her stillness that indicated whether a letter had arrived recently or not. When one had come, May was settled in a way that expressed itself in small physical details. The coat hung on the hook rather than kept on. The soup ordered with something closer to appetite than habit. The tip left with the ease of someone who was, in that particular moment, not counting anything. When one had not come, May ordered the same thing and left the same tip and sat with the same contained precision. But the stillness had a different quality, more managed, the stillness of someone who has decided not to think about a thing and is working to maintain that decision. Hannah served her the same way regardless. Coffee poured at the right moment. Soup brought without delay. The counter wiped in the long familiar motion that she had made enough times now that it had become something below habit, something closer to reflex. May asked her, one Friday in early October, where she was from. Hannah said, Cologne. May said, is your family there? Hannah said, my mother. My sister. May said, have you heard from them? Hannah said, through the Red Cross. Letters take a long time. May nodded. She drank her coffee. After a moment she said, my boy's name is Thomas. He's 22. Before the war, he worked at the grain elevator in town. He was going to take over the manager's job when Mr. Purvis retired. She paused. He's good with numbers. Hannah said, my brother was good with numbers too. She had not intended to say it. It came out with the ease of something that had been waiting a long time for the right opening. Not a dramatic revelation. Simply information that belonged in the conversation. May looked at her. Hannah said, he died in 1941. In France. She said it in the level tone she had developed for this fact over 2 years of carrying it. Not flat. Not theatrical. Just the tone of a thing that was true and had been absorbed into the daily structure of who she was. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm sorry. 2 words. No qualification. No careful navigation of the political geography of the statement. No acknowledgement that her son was fighting people like Hannah's brother. No diplomatic management of the complexity. Just, I'm sorry. The direct, horizontal grammar of one person acknowledging another person's loss. Because loss was loss and the flag it flew didn't change what it was. Hannah said, thank you. May finished her soup and left her 14 cents and went out through the screen door. Hannah stood at the counter for a moment and then picked up the coins and held them and thought about her brother Carl, who had been 24 and good with numbers and had gone to France in 1940 and come back in a box in the spring of 1941, and about the way she had not spoken his name out loud since the funeral because speaking it in the wrong context carried risks she had not wanted to calculate. She put the coins in her tin. She thought, here I said his name to an American woman whose son is fighting a war that killed him, and the woman said she was sorry, and that was the entire transaction, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the kind of thing that was only possible in a place where a person's grief was not a political position, but simply a human fact that other humans were permitted to acknowledge without calculating the implications first. October brought the Christmas preparations into full visibility. The donation drive that Clara Hess and the Methodist women had been organizing since June had reached its operational phase, and the evidence of it appeared in Dottie's in the form of conversations and lists, and the specific energized efficiency of a community project entering its execution stage. The box that appeared on the counter near the register, a plain cardboard box with a hand-lettered sign reading Camp Hearn Christmas Fund, donations welcome, was Dottie's contribution, placed there without announcement one Tuesday morning in the second week of October. Customers added to it with varying degrees of ceremony. Harold dropped coins in on his way out without breaking stride, with the manner of a man completing a line item on a list he kept internally. Walt added a folded bill one morning with the satisfied expression of a task accomplished. The Dempsey brothers had an argument about how much to put in, and eventually Ray put in what Calvin suggested and Calvin put in what Ray suggested, which resolved the argument by making it irrelevant. Hannah watched the box fill over the weeks of October with the specific attention of someone for whom the filling of the box was not a neutral event. The camp it would benefit was 4 kilometers from where she stood. The prisoners it would benefit were people like her. People who had come across the Atlantic in converted transport vessels and been processed at Norfolk and traveled through unconcealed American industry and arrived at a camp in Texas with electric lights and individual mattresses and a canteen where you could choose your own purchases. People who had been, by the accumulating evidence of 4 months behind a lunch counter, consistently treated as people. She added 3 cents to the box one afternoon during the slow period. 3 cents from the tin, chosen carefully, placed in through the slot with the deliberateness of a person who understands the symbolic weight of a small act. Dottie saw her do it from the kitchen pass-through and said nothing, which was the right response. The repatriation announcement came on a Thursday morning in late October. Hannah learned about it not at camp, but at the counter, from Denton, who came in for his afternoon coffee and told her with the careful, unhurried manner he brought to things he understood required time to land. He said the transport schedule had been set. January departure. The eastern seaboard first, then ships to Europe. Then whatever Germany had become in the meantime, which was a subject nobody at camp discussed directly, because the information available was specific and terrible and required a quality of processing that was difficult to manage inside a barracks. Hannah poured his coffee and stood at the counter with the cloth in her hand. January. 11 weeks. She had known it was coming. The war in Europe had ended in May. The administrative machinery of repatriation had been visible in camp since summer in the form of forms and interviews, and the particular organizational energy of an institution preparing to reverse a large logistical process. She had known it intellectually in the same way she had known, 14 days into the Atlantic crossing, that land was coming. As a fact requiring acknowledgement rather than a surprise requiring adjustment. But knowing and arriving at it were different things. She had learned this at the Norfolk dock and at the Harrisburg platform and at the Cotton Gin parking lot. And she was learning it again now, standing at the counter of a lunch establishment in Hearn, Texas, understanding that the thing she had been living inside for 4 months was going to end in 11 weeks, and she was going to return to a country she did not yet know how to think about. She wiped the counter. She served the afternoon customers. She poured Harold's coffee when he came in at his usual time and listened to his opinion about the post-war grain markets with the full attention she had given every Harold opinion for 4 months, because the opinions were worth the attention, not because she agreed with all of them, but because they were the opinions of a man who had the right to have them and exercised that right every day with the comfortable regularity of someone who had never been required to perform the calculation of whether it was safe to speak. She thought, I want to carry this home. Not the opinions. The assumption underneath them. The assumption that your thoughts belong to you and the space to say them is the normal condition rather than the exception. May Hollis came in on the last Friday of October. She was settled. A letter had come that week. Hannah could tell by the coat on the hook. She ordered her soup and her coffee and ate with the quiet appetite of someone whose worry had been given a temporary reprieve. She talked a little, more than usual, about Thomas, about a detail from his letter about the food on his ship, about a joke he had apparently made about Navy coffee that she had written down to remember. She was, for that hour, simply a mother who had heard from her son and was relieved and wanted to sit with the relief in a place that was familiar. Hannah refilled her coffee once and left her otherwise to it. At the end of the meal, May placed her 14 cents on the counter. Then she sat for a moment without standing, which was a departure from her usual pattern. She said, I heard you're going back in January. Hannah said, yes. May said, what will you do when you get back? Hannah thought about this. Not the immediate practical answer. She had thought about that in the barracks, the logistics of returning to a city she had last seen in 1943 and that had been bombed substantially since. She thought about the deeper answer, the one that had been forming since June with the slow accumulation of evidence that ends not in a conclusion, but in a direction. She said, I kept books before. Allocation ledgers. I think I will keep different books now. May looked at her. Different how? Hannah said, the ledgers I kept, they counted things. Materials. Allocations. Workers alongside materials. She paused, looking for the English. I want to keep books where the workers are in a different column, where they are not the same category as the machines. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that sounds right. She stood and put on her coat. She looked at Hannah with the direct, uncomplicated gaze she had used since the first Friday. The gaze of a person who sees who is in front of them and has made their assessment without requiring it to be complicated. She said, I hope somebody was good to your brother. Over there. Before. Hannah said, I hope somebody is good to your son. Over there. Now. May nodded once. The specific nod of a transaction completed between two people who have understood each other exactly. She went out through the screen door. The bell rang once. The Christmas feast at camp was on December 24th. Hannah had known the numbers in advance from the overhead conversations at the counter, the quartermaster records, the donation totals, the menu that the Hearn Democrat had printed in its December 23rd edition with the same matter-of-fact coverage it gave to everything the town did for the camp, which was the coverage of a community that had decided this was simply part of what it did and did not require special justification. Roast turkey, ham, sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, pie, ice cream, beer for the enlisted men, California wine for the officers. 5,000 calories per person, while German civilian rations, when available, provided 1,200. Hannah sat at the table in the camp dining hall with the specific surreality of a person experiencing something they have been told about in advance, and found on the counter, and walked out, and did not make anything of the fact that it was the last time. Walled at 7 with his newspaper and his reading glasses. He read and ate, and left his 15 cents with a mechanical consistency that had not varied once in 4 months. At the door he paused and turned and said, You did good work here, Hannah. Then he went out. The Dempsey brothers at 7:30, finishing each other's sentences about the harvest yield, arguing about whether to order biscuits, and deciding to split one, leaving a combined tip that Ray counted out while Calvin watched, and then Calvin adjusted by adding 1 coin while Ray watched, and both of them satisfied with the result. Clara Hess came in at 10:30, which was not her usual time, and Hannah understood when she came through the door that she had come specifically because it was the last day. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee and said without preamble, We're going to miss you around here. She said it simply, the way she said most things, as a statement of observable fact that did not require emotional management. Hannah said, I will miss this, and meant it simply, the way Clara had. Clara drank her coffee and talked about the donation drive. It had exceeded its target, the packages were ready, the choir had one more rehearsal before the camp concert. She talked about Thomas Hollis, May's son, who had written again and was still all right. She talked about Reverend Mills's sermon the previous Sunday, which had been about the obligation to see the person in front of you rather than the category they belonged to, which she said was a good sermon and one he should give more often. She left a good tip and squeezed Hannah's hand briefly on her way out. The quick, warm grip of a woman who expresses things through the hands rather than the face because the hands are more honest. Dottie came out of the kitchen at 2:30 when the last customer had gone and the counter had been wiped for the last time, and the coffee urn had been cleaned and the pie dome had been covered for the day. She stood at the end of the counter and looked at the room with the expression of a person who has worked in a space for a long time and knows every inch of it, and is simply present in it for a moment before the day ends. She took the apron from the hook and held it out. She said, "Keep it." Hannah said, "It is yours." Dottie said, "I've got 4 more. Keep it." Hannah took it and folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep rather than use, and put it under her arm. Dottie said, "You're a good worker. You've got good hands and you pay attention. Those are the 2 things." She looked at the counter. "Whoever you work for next is going to be lucky." She went back into the kitchen. Hannah stood in the empty room for a moment. The counter and the 12 stools, and the menu board with its 12 items, and the 2 small tables, and the jukebox with its colored panels, and the screen door with its bell, and the window with its light coming through at the October angle. Different from June. Everything different from June. And yet the room itself continuous and unchanged, doing what it had always done, receiving whoever came through the door and providing them with coffee and pie. And the specific social warmth of a place that had been open since 6 in the morning every day for 20 years and intended to keep being open tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. She went out through the screen door. The bell rang once. The transport home left Camp Hearn in the 3rd week of January 1944. Hannah sat in the bus with her bag on her lap and the folded apron on top of it and the notebook in her coat pocket beside the 2 hair clips. The tin of tip coins was in her bag, 47 cents, uncounted for the last month, kept as they were. She had decided, in the end, not to spend them and not to keep them as coins. She had decided to carry them home and put them somewhere she would see them, as a reminder of a specific arithmetic, that the person who serves you is worth something, and that worth can be expressed in the small concrete language of coins on a counter, and that a society which understood this was a different kind of society from one that did not. She thought she would put them on her desk, wherever her desk was. Next to the ledgers, when she had ledgers again. The bus moved through Robertson County in the January morning light, past the Cotton Gin on the edge of town, the part told about in advance, and finding that the telling had not prepared them for the thing itself. The turkey was real. The cranberry sauce, a thing she had not encountered before, tart and sweet in a combination that had no German equivalent she could name, was real. The ice cream was real in the specific way of things that are more real than they need to be, more present than the category requires, the kind of real that makes you aware that you have been living at a reduced resolution and have only now encountered the full version. She ate slowly. Around her the other women ate with varying qualities of attention. Some with the focused appetite of people who had learned not to miss an opportunity, some with the stunned deliberateness of people processing what the meal represented, some, the ones who had been here longest, with the settled ease of people who had already absorbed the information and were simply eating dinner. The 30-foot Christmas tree in the main compound was visible through the dining hall window. It had been up for a week, its electric lights burning continuously, visible from the road into camp and from the fields around it, and from the county road at the point where the land rose slightly and the camp's lights became distinguishable from the stars. The tree used more electricity for its decorations than most German villages had for all purposes. It stood in a Texas field in December 1943 and burned continuously because the people who put it up had not thought to consider that it might be too much, because too much was not a category that governed the gesture. After the meal, the Methodist choir arrived. Mrs. Patterson, the one who had not been surprised that her choir had a good ear, led them to the front of the dining hall in their church clothes. 22 people of various ages who arranged themselves in the practiced configuration of a group that had been doing this together for years. They had their sheet music, though most of them did not look at it. They sang Still Nacht first. Hannah had heard this song every Christmas of her life. She had sung it in school, in church, at home around whatever approximation of celebration the war years had permitted. She knew every syllable of it. She could have sung it herself without preparation, in her sleep, in the dark. She had never heard it sung by 22 American strangers who had learned it phonetically because enemy prisoners should have proper carols at Christmas, and someone had decided that providing them was the obvious thing to do. The choir sang with the careful precision of people who do not understand the words they are singing, but understand that the words matter to the people listening. And this understanding produces a quality of attention in the performance that is different from, and in some ways more moving than the fluency of people who have known the words all their lives. Still Nacht. Heilige Nacht. Several women around Hannah were crying. Not dramatically, quietly, with the contained quality of people who had decided to allow a thing they had been managing for a long time, letting it surface in this specific moment because the specific moment was the right container for it. Hannah did not cry. She sat very still and listened to the choir and thought about Carl, who had been good with numbers and had died in France in 1941, and about May Hollis's son Thomas, who was good with numbers and was alive somewhere in the Pacific, and about the distance between those two outcomes and what had produced it and what it meant. She thought about a parking lot full of workers' personal cars on a Tuesday morning in June. She thought about 12 items on a menu board, all available. She thought about a letter to a senator about a road, the third letter, sent because that was how the mechanism worked, and the mechanism worked because everyone understood it was supposed to. She thought about 14 cents placed beside 12 with the simple, horizontal logic of, somebody somewhere is being decent, and decency moves in whatever direction it's available. She thought about Dottie saying she's working my counter in the voice that required no further argument. She thought about what kind of bookkeeper she was going to be. On her last day at Dottie's, the regulars came in as they always had. Harold at 6:15, had on the counter, coffee before he asked, an opinion about the post-war agricultural policy already assembled and ready for delivery. He delivered it to Hannah with the same comfortable directness he had used for 4 months, as if she were simply the person who happened to be there, which was exactly what she was. She refilled his coffee and listened, and he left his 2 coins and his hat impression on the same rows of personal vehicles, the same unremarkable permanence of things that belonged where they were. She did not count them. She watched them pass. She thought about what she was going back to, not in the administrative sense, the rubble and the ration cards, and the machinery of reconstruction that was going to require everyone she knew to become a different kind of person than the war had made them. She thought about it in the personal sense, the question of who she intended to be on the other side of the Atlantic, with the specific knowledge she was carrying in a folded apron and a notebook and 47 cents in a tin. She thought about keeping different books. Books where the workers were not in the same column as the machinery. Books where a human body was not a resource to be allocated but a person with a life that continued after the shift ended and required, like all lives, the basic infrastructure of continuation. Books that counted things honestly, not the way the allocation ledgers had counted, which was the counting of a system that had decided in advance what was worth counting and what was not, but the way you count when you want to understand what is actually there. She thought about what Mrs. Patterson's choir had sounded like singing Still Nacked with careful phonetic precision because it mattered to the people listening. She thought about Harold's voice, unafraid, filling a room with opinions that belonged to him and that no one could take. She thought about May Hollis placing 2 extra coins beside 12 with the logic that decency moved in whatever direction it was available. She thought about the screen doorbell ringing 10,000 times for 10,000 different people and meaning the same thing every time. Someone is here. The day has started. There is work to do. The bus turned onto the highway heading east, away from Hearn and away from Robertson County, and toward the Atlantic and whatever came next, and the Texas landscape opened on both sides in the January light, wide and flat, and indifferent and continuous, doing what it had always done, undisturbed. Hannah held the folded apron in her lap. She looked out the window. She thought, I am going back to a country that is going to need people who know what this looks like, who have seen it working, who understand that it is not an accident or an abundance or a feature of geography, but a decision, a collective, daily, renewable decision, that a society makes about what it believes every person at the counter is worth. She thought, I know what it looks like now. She thought, I will not forget. The highway went on ahead of the bus, straight and well-maintained, and above it the January sky was pale and wide and enormous, the kind of sky that went on past the point where looking had any purpose, the kind of sky that had no equivalent in a city, the kind of sky that had been here before the war and would be here after it, and required no permission from anyone to continue being exactly what it was. Hannah watched it until the town was gone, and then she watched the fields, and then she watched the road, and then she closed her eyes and held the apron and let the motion of the bus carry her forward into whatever came next. It was enough. It was, she understood, more than enough.